community.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on Senator Moore's motion regarding the fuel tax. And I just rise and I wonder, and I put the question to the Abbott government, is how much more money are they going to take out of the purses and wallets of Australians? How much more money, and when can Australians have some certainty that the robbing that's going on currently of family budgets will stop? And I also pose a second question, and that is, does the Abbott government really understand the effects of its harsh, cruel budget? And it seems to me that they're the only people in Australia who continue to support their budget, although we're seeing by degrees they move away from sections of it each week. But they obviously have no understanding of its real impact in the Australian community. And every one of the Abbott government's broken promises has an effect on the household budgets of Australians, especially low-income Australians, Australians who live on benefits and Australians who live on the aged pension. Every one of its no surprises government takes us by surprise, and it takes its toll, whether it's the higher education reform package or whether it's this new fuel tax. These have an impact on the budgets of Australian families. And the fuel tax, what a sneaky move, and what a fast move, a sneaky and fast move, because it will take effect in the next pay packet of Australians. So this is the last pay packets most Australians will get before they've got to pay additional money at the petrol bowser. And the fuel tax could come under a number of the Abbott government's glib statements. Is it a broken promise? Or is it a no new tax? Or is it we'll be a government of no surprises? Well, it's probably every one of these. But what really matters is that it adds to the battering of budgets by the Abbott government. Remember when, it's almost becoming a slogan in itself, remember when the Prime Minister, or Mr Abbott, became the Prime Minister and he was elected, and he kept saying in those first early weeks that he had a mandate. He had a mandate for this, he had a mandate for that, he had a mandate for everything, seemingly, according to the Prime Minister. Well, for those who believe that, for those who believe in mandates, the Abbott government certainly had no mandate to hit Australians with a fuel tax, because Mr Abbott repeatedly said there will be no new taxes under my government. There will be no new taxes under my government. And yet what he's done is he's sneakily imposed this new fuel tax. And seemingly the partners in the coalition, the Nationals, who you would expect, who again say that they are there as the party of the bush, to stick up for regional and remote Australians, well, I'm not quite sure when was the last time that they fuelled their cars and paid for it out of their pockets. But regional and rural Australians do that weekly. And we all know that fuel in the country, fuel in the bush, fuel in remote areas is incredibly expensive. But maybe what the Abbott government and indeed the Nationals have missed is that there are low-income earners in the bush. Not everybody owns a farm or has some kind of benefit that they can write off in tax, but there are aged care workers who live in the bush. There are early childhood educators who live in the bush. There are those who work in roadhouses who live in the bush, and they earn very meagre wages. They earn $18, $19, $20, $21 an hour. But the Nationals, in their partnership with the Abbott government to impose this sneaky deal, seem to have completely forgotten all about those folk. And many of those workers, particularly where they work in aged care, work part-time, and they drive a significant distance to work each day. And that part-time wage has to stretch across a family budget. It's got to stretch across a family budget. And the other fact that Mr Abbott seems to not know, and in fact every time he says this is indeed a small increase, and we've heard government senators say that in this place here today, this is a small increase, they fail to understand that low-income earners and pensioners and those living on benefits actually don't fill their cars to the full. They don't fill them to the full. And why is that? Because they can't afford it now. So they put in exactly the amount of money that they need to get to work or to do the family errands. And this morning I had the privilege of attending the Parliamentary Friends of Early Educators, and some of my former comrades from United Voice were there, and a lot of the educators were there. And these are predominantly women who work in a professional capacity, but unfortunately don't get a professional wage. And not only that, for these women, the Abbott government months and months ago took wages out of their pay packets when they cancelled the Early Years Quality Fund. Now, these are women who earn $20 to $21 a week, many of whom have children of $20 to $21 an hour, and they have children of their own. They struggle with mortgages, and believe me, Mr Acting Deputy President, they never have the money to fuel up their cars, never, ever. So they put enough fuel in their cars to get them to and from work, to pick their kids up, to run them to places, and there are no additional funds available for any extras. So this increase in the fuel tax will hit those educators that I was meeting with this morning in the pocket by November 10th. In their next pay packet, when they go to look at that fuel bowser, they're going to have to recalculate the family budget, and something else will drop off it because they don't earn enough right now to live a decent life. They don't earn enough to put their own children into quality care, and they certainly, very few of them, if they're single income earners with children, don't earn enough to buy a house. But all of that just goes completely over the Abbott government's heads, completely over their heads, particularly when the Prime Minister keeps standing up and saying this is a small increase. Well, every time he says that, he sends a message to ordinary Australians, those struggling on low wages, that he is simply well out of touch with what happens to their family budgets. And I'm really surprised that the Nationals, who know the high cost of fuel in the bush, would accept such a deal from the government. But wait, there's more. I recall earlier in the year, I think it was the Liberals, as part of the coalition, who tricked the Nationals. That's right. They said to them, and they let it slip out, that actually what they wanted to do was put a tax on diesel. And of course they knew predictably the Nationals would blow up about that, and so they said, oh, but the fallback position, because, you know, we've got to get some money from somewhere, we'll put a tax on fuel. So the Nationals wiped their brows and went, whew, gee, we dodged a bullet then. Yep, we can have this tax on fuel in the bush, because they demonstrate that they are out of touch with what happens in Halls Creek when people fill up their cars, what happens in Kununurra when people fill up their cars, what happens in Esperance when people fill up their cars, or Waroona. Name any remote town in Western Australia and you know that you're paying a significant amount more for petrol when you fill your car, not to full, but put enough in there to get you to work. Completely passes the Nationals by, and then we have the Prime Minister of the country standing up and saying it's only a small increase. Well, keep saying that Prime Minister Abbott, because every time you say that, you will remind Australians that you are completely out of touch. And one of the government members has been brave enough to stand up and call it as it is. Senator McDonald is on the public record as saying this is a low move. This is going to hurt low-income earners. So he had the courage to tell the truth on this matter. The rest of the government have obviously chosen to put up and shut up, but not Senator McDonald. He has called it as it is. And he's not the only one. We have the Australian Automobile Association Chief Executive, Andrew McKellar. Now, automobile associations are not the radical fringe. You can't attack them like you do unions. You know, they're pretty conservative groups. They're out there and they, are pretty polite because they know they rely on governments of whatever political persuasions to be nice to them. But even he has come out and called the petrol move, and I quote, weak, sneaky and tricky, end quote. And why does he do that? He did that because the government has avoided any scrutiny on this sneaky move by using the customs tariff. And it did that because it does not want to come before this parliament and have to answer questions about why it's doing it. It doesn't want to have transparency and the scrutiny of the parliament. It is a government of surprises, quite contrary to when Mr Abbott stood up and said, I'm a government and I want to be a government of no surprises. Well, there's just constant surprises with this government. Every day we see surprises. And let's not forget where else the Abbott government has attacked working Australians. We had that sudden freeze on superannuation. And somehow we've heard in this chamber today from government senators that that freeze on superannuation has been good for them because they'll have this additional invisible money in their pockets to spend each week. And that just shows the absolute ignorance of the government in not understanding how industrial superannuation is paid. It comes from the employer through to the workers. So when the Abbott government puts a freeze on industry superannuation, it lets the boss off, so the boss saves money and the workers miss out. Nothing actually goes into their pockets. And that is the most ridiculous move I've seen from the government to freeze retirement incomes. Why would you do that with an ageing population? But somehow government senators have said today that money that has been frozen is going to magically go out of the boss's pocket and into the worker's pocket, and the worker will have more money. I mean, that is a complete myth and just demonstrates total ignorance about how the superannuation system works, just like suggesting that this increase in fuel is not going to cost Australians very much at all. Well, it will, and they won't forget who has done this to them. And then let's not forget the threats we've had from Senator Cormann when he said somehow that, if Labor didn't support this move, that we would be held responsible for giving money back, that somehow money that had to go back to fuel companies would be our fault. Now, I know the Abbott government likes to scapegoat Labor almost on a daily basis, and if it's not Labor, it's the unions, but it's mostly Labor. But seriously, a decision that the government has taken, a sneaky decision, a decision that's avoided the scrutiny of the parliament to increase the costs of fuel for everyday Australians, that the government is somehow going to try and say, well, it's all Labor's fault. I mean, who's going to believe that? That's the most ridiculous assertion I've heard in a long while. And where is this budget emergency that the government talks about? Because 63 leading Australian economists have said there isn't one. And what's the money going to go into? Apparently, it's going into roads, not public transport, but to roads. I mean, how is that moving the country forward? How is putting more roads in place of assistance to those that rely on public transport? You think if the government was going to do this, it would look at a better spend for its dollar. But no, it is so out of touch. It is so opposed to public transport. It said a few months ago, well, that's a state government responsibility. It's not an area the federal government gets involved in, so we're going to continue to fund roads. Well, I could tell you that people in Western Australia don't need more roads. We need more public transport. We don't even have in Western Australia public transport to the airport. And I tell you what, if you live in a suburb and you want to get to another suburb on the other side of town, it's maybe a 2 or 3 hour bus trip, if a trip is available at all. We clearly need expenditure on all forms of transport, but seemingly that's not going to eventuate under this government. So this is just another sneaky attack on the purses and the wallets and the cost of living of every Australian. It's also a sneak attack on the Parliament and a total disregard for the Senate. But that seems to be one of the things that the Abbott government excels in, is being sneaky and disregarding parliamentary processes. And this isn't just about the fuel tax. It's a demonstration of the lengths the Prime Minister and his team will go to undermine the Parliament and to sneak increases into Australian families' costs. And maybe what they're hoping, the Abbott government, is that because this hasn't gone through the Parliament and because it's avoided that public scrutiny that the Parliament provides, that somehow Australians might blame the fuel companies. Well, I'm sure the fuel companies are already have outsmarted the Abbott government on that, and I'm sure that they are not going to accept responsibility for this increase. And we know that raising petrol excise taxes is regressive. As the Conversation said, and I quote, "Higher fuel prices will raise the cost of living for consumers on low income who are not financially able to upgrade to a fuel-efficient vehicle, nor are they able to reduce kilometres travelled if they live in an area that has limited access to public transport. Consumers and businesses entitled to claim a tax deduction for higher fuel costs may not be discouraged from buying high-emitting vehicles and reducing kilometres travelled." End quote. And I know that many educators and aged carers and disability service workers and hospitality workers don't live in the hearts of our cities. And why don't they live there? Because the rents are too high. They can't afford to live there. Most workers that I know live at least an hour's travel away from their workplace. And added to that, many of them are shift workers. They might start at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. in the morning, and that's often at a time when public transport is not running. So they have little other available options other than to take their car, and they will fill it only with enough fuel so that they do their shifts with a little bit of spare. And if you want the evidence of that, I'd ask you to look at the Fair Work Commission and to look at the submissions that were put forward as part of United Voice's low-paid bargaining application. And there is submission after submission there from aged care workers which tell the story of how difficult and almost impossible it is for them to balance their budgets on their meagre incomes. And now the Abbott government has gone completely behind their backs and the backs of other low-paid workers in this country, pensioners and those on benefits, to hike up the cost of fuel without a single care for those struggling the most in our community. A government which is absolutely out of touch, a government who looks after the elite and the wealthy in our community and has shown scant regard for anyone else. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President.